Behind me are over 80 human skulls, and day to day here at JonsBones, we work with retired medical remains, where we partner with universities and museums, where we sell these pieces back to institutions. Nowadays, an average skull can range from between $16,000 to $3,000. But what did the osteological trade look like back in the 1980s, 1950s, and 1920s? For today's video, we're gonna take a look at that. So what is the historical context here? Well, in 1920 all the way to 1980, it used to be mandatory for medical students to purchase their own teaching models, and this is why human remains started to be sold all over the world. So let's talk about how we know where these pieces came from and how we work towards dating archival pieces in the medical bone trade. So how do we know all this? Well, the answer is right here. This is actually an antique postcard. Right now it's presumed to date back to around 1920. So in this postcard, there are two medical students posing with a real human skeleton. So once we have a date in mind for the skeletons, we actually compare what we know for the skeletons to what's actually seen in the postcard, and if they both match, we have an answer. Now, the skeleton that closely resembles this skeleton, we have dated to around 1920 to 1940. And this postcard historically dates back to 1920. So this postcard helps validate our claims on when this period of skeleton was created. So this is one of the ways that we apply archival and historical research into dating these historical pieces, which I just think is so cool. So a quick disclaimer, when it comes to skeletal research, there's so many different facets that you can look at when it comes to identifying the history and provenance of these pieces. So for the context of this video, we're gonna only focus on archival history today when it comes to the medical bone trade. So this here is actually one of my rarest pieces of archival photographs we have in the collection, and it is small, but it was the most expensive. This piece here actually shows 5 medical skeletons, but the context behind it is very bizarre, and I'm still actively trying to figure out more about the history of these photographs. But what I do know is the type of camera it was taken on dates back to around 1850. So there we have a general timeline based on the film and photograph presented here. But if we see on the inside, there are actually 5 medical skeletons. They all have white gowns behind them, and one of them is sitting in the middle. I'm not really sure the context of why this photo was taken. It doesn't look like it's in a medical context, but it could be an Oddfellows skeleton, which we've discussed in previous videos, the history behind them. But it is super interesting and places a timeline and a date towards these skeletons, which is roughly around 1850. Now, we also look here, there's a loose torso on the side of the photograph right on the floor, and there's just so much happening here. So if we can actually study the skeletons in this photo, we can compare and contrast it more to pieces in the collection. Because these pieces are so old and there was no internet, the way that we were able to do this research is only by these existing photographs. But if we look here, it's just such a bizarre photo. It appears to have been taken in a barn. I see hay in the background, and it's just such a weird photo, and I can't quite tell what's going on, but if you guys have thoughts in the comments of what you think is happening in this photo, please let me know. But all the skeletons are posed and set up in a very particular way. And apparently the original collector that sold me this piece told me that the type of paper and film that it was shot on was extremely rare at the time. So to have an existing photo like this is incredible. But take a look at it, guys, and let me know what you think in the comments. So the next piece we're going to talk about is actually right here. This is another postcard. Postcards with skeletons in them were really popular from the 90s all the way up into the 50s. So now they're considered antique and we use them as archival material, but back then it was no different than what you'd buy at any Walmart or Macy's. But this actually, it's almost possible to see because of how faded it is, but there's a medical skeleton in here. It appears to be a Freemason postcard. There's a lot of Freemason imagery here, and Freemasons were also very notorious for using medical skeletons in their practice. But this says F&AM, the master, copyright for Robert Schneider, New York. Interesting, because we're based in New York City. All rights reserved. But this was a super interesting postcard. that now falls out of the realm of medical skeletons, but someone had taken a medical skeleton and has propped it up for this photo, and there's a lot of interesting Freemason imagery. The skeleton appears to be from our great friends Adam Ruley, based in the UK. I can tell this just based on the hardware and preparations used. But from this kind of context, we're really able to figure out more about how these skeletons were used and what the history of them are. So for context, this is an original Kilgore International skull. We know this because the skull came with the original Kilgore International carrying case that came from the original owner. So interestingly enough, the original owner was having a party, and the skull used to be on display on their first house when they moved out at 18 years old. And actually someone from the party knocked over the skull and it knocked out the 2 front teeth. So if we look at this original photo, the teeth are intact. And just with history, he eventually lost the teeth, and now this is what the skull looks like. So it's so interesting to finally have historical context on a skull and what it looked like before damage. We have so many pieces in the collection that have damage in them, so to see a before and after and what can happen if a skull is not properly taken care of is super interesting. So let's think about shopping catalogs for a second. This was an original bone shopping catalog where inside they would have different skulls that were for sale. Now think to what happens today. You get an Amazon catalog in the mail. It has the top 10 must-haves for the summer vacation. Well, you might look at it for a second and then you throw it away. The exact same thing happened to these catalogs because they weren't considered historically significant at the time. So think 100 years later, if Amazon were to go out of business, people would be studying them the way that we do these today. So this is something that's always important when it comes to our line of work, is historical paperwork, and very little of it actually survives. This leads me to original invoices. People always say these are human remains, there has to be paperwork, but there just simply isn't. Out of thousands of skulls that I've seen over my career, I've only seen around 4 to 5 existing invoices. They're extremely rare and hard to find. Let me ask you, for anyone watching, do you still have the original invoice for the fridge you bought? No? Why not? And the exact same thing happened for human bones. People just didn't keep invoices as well as they should have, and they got lost with history. Some of these skulls have been possessed by 5 or 6 different people before eventually coming down to the JonsBones showroom. So because of that, skulls trade hands, they go to collections or they go to museums that eventually sell them off, and then from there they come into the public market. So existing pieces of paperwork is extremely hard to find. I'm gonna be stressing this the whole video, but in that, I wanna really show you some of the interesting pieces that we have today at the showroom. So this is actually one of my favorite invoices. The side profile of the skeleton and the bold Reddit invoice is just chef's kiss, one of my favorites to date. But this is actually from the company ASA Anatomical Supply, and they were actually based out of New York City in the 80s. And if we look at it here, this invoice is for a human skull, natural bone, first grade, adult male with no calvarium cut. It says the New York City state tax and the total received. Now looking to the price, it's $65 with tax included was $70.36. Taking a look at it, 1984 to 2002 at $70, give or take. This skull would have been worth $200 today, including inflation. So could you imagine back in the day purchasing a human skull for just $70 in the 80s? That's kind of what I wanted to show you guys. There were so many skulls available, so many people were purchasing them, and that's how inexpensive they were back in the day. Uncut human skulls are extremely rare, and that same skull today would sell for around $3,000 to $4,000. Now, here's what's super interesting about this invoice. If we look here, it's dated September 25th, 1984. And for anyone with a keen ear, 1984 is a very specific year when it comes to the history of the medical bone trade, because that's actually the primary year that India banned exportation of human remains. And after that, the industry subsequently collapsed and all these companies went out of business because they were the leading exporter of human remains up into the 80s. So till this day, I never find invoices that go past 1984. It's almost like the trade collapsed and it almost ended it eventually right there. But if we look at the historical context of this specific paperwork, it's right at the height of when the trade just ended, which is super interesting. So we just looked at a historic invoice from 1984. Now let's look at a modern invoice from 2019. I wanted to put my money where my mouth is, and hopefully in the future, pieces from this collection are studied. This is actually an original invoice from my first ever skeleton that I purchased here at the showroom. So this is an auction that took place. A prominent doctor had passed away, and when they were clearing out his estate, he actually had a medical skeleton, and I was fortunate enough to win that part of the auction, and I purchased the skeleton for the showroom. If we look at the description here, it's lot 344, real human skeleton / casket. And the total bid that I was able to get this skeleton for in 2019 was $1,550. It's a super interesting snapshot of skeletal history because skeletons nowadays sell for $5,000 to $7,000. So if we look back just at 2019, skeletons were selling for between $1,500 to $3,000. So the prices are constantly increasing as these skeletons become rarer and rarer. And for one of the last invoices that we have in the showroom, this was actually the first one we ever got in the collection. Now, I don't like to take this one out so much because of how fragile it is, but for just the video, I had to show you guys. This is an original Adam Ruley purchase order for a half skeleton bone set. So Adam Ruley was the most prominent skeletal supply company in the world, and they're still in business today. And this is an original archival piece from 1983. It's a student grade natural bone half skeleton, and the price was 46 pounds. Adjusted for inflation today, this skeleton would be around $150, an entire human skeleton. So here's what's crazy. That skull that we covered earlier in the video sold for $70 back in 1984. But a year prior to that, an entire half skeleton sold for just 40 pounds. Isn't that insane? So what's interesting is on the back of this invoice, there's actually some math from the original owner for how much this piece would cost and its conversion, which was super interesting. But this is one of the only pieces of surviving Adam Ruley paperwork that we have that's invoice-based, and there were thousands and thousands of medical skeletons produced by this company to really show you how rare this piece of history is. Now, if you've made it this far into the video and you like looking at paper as much as I do, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. All right, Adam Ruley, my favorite bone company from the UK. Fun fact, actually, the original JonsBones logo, my blue colored shirt that I was wearing was the Adam Ruley blue that they have on their logo, paying homage to the original bone company because they were one of the first. So this one's funny because a dealer in the UK actually had this, and I was like, he had it for sale for $100, and this is a sheet of A4 paper. And I messaged him and I was like, I will give you $200 right now if you sell this to me and no one else. And I bought it. So I have it here today at the showroom. Dude, finding original pieces of paperwork is so rare. I've been doing this for so long and I've never seen a price list from Adam Ruley. So when this came available, I was like, gimme, 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 gimme. So what this is here, this is perfect. I can read it and you guys can actually see what the back is because it's double-sided. So practically I got 2 pieces of paper for $200, $100 each. That's what I tell myself. It's an original Adam Ruley price list of human bones dating back to 1966. So we've covered 1963, we've covered 1964. Now we're going even further back in time. So a human foot wired up in 1966 was 4 pounds. Can you imagine? You could buy an entire human foot for just 4 pounds. A human hand on a wire is 3 pounds. Now, interestingly enough, hands are more valuable than feet in the current market. So it's interesting that the foot is $4 and the hand is $3 here. I'm just gonna say dollars just so it's simpler for my American audience. So a human hand today costs around $530. So back then it was around $5 to $6 to buy a human hand. Look at this. A human vertebral column, so a spine, would sell for 15 pounds. I need to do some math. Inflation calculator. You could buy a spine back in the day for only $20. Nowadays, they cost over $1,300. If the same prices were today, a human spine would cost around $200 adjusted for inflation. This is absolutely wild. A female pelvis was 20 pounds. An articulated male pelvis was 10 pounds. Our disarticulated inbox grade 2 was 33 pounds. Damn, the prices are kind of weird. Interesting. A disarticulated bone box, which we've covered in previous videos, as you can see above, 55 pounds. Interesting. Prices were crazy. That's what I wanted to explain to you guys, is we're always talking about how readily available these pieces were and how easy it was to purchase it, but this is a prime example of really how much the pieces used to buy and sell for. Well, there you have it, guys. A little bit of bone history to spice up your day. Any of you guys are as interested in learning about paper as I am, feel free to always reach out on Instagram. I'm always happy to talk about archival records when it comes to the bone trade. It's part of the very little surviving evidence. Drinking game, to rewatch the video and take a sip every time I say, these pieces are extremely rare. A message to any future sellers or anyone that might actually own a skull, the original provenance is extremely important, and documenting them and preserving them for future generations is of the utmost importance. I actually got a catalog from a modern bone company, and I was so close. I read it, a lot of cool stuff, and I was ready to chuck it in the bin. And I was like, wow, this is exactly what got us into the problem in the first place. Was I read the catalog and then I was ready to throw it away. So make sure you're saving your documents. It's all really important, and maybe one day it can be extremely helpful in uncovering a lost history. Thanks everyone for watching the video. I hope you had a blast. We had a great time making this. And make sure to tune in for future videos. So ciao everyone.